Welcome to the Still City Recovery Podcast, your beacon of hope and support on the journey to recovery from addiction. Whether you're contemplating a life free from substance dependency or are already on the path to sobriety, this podcast is here for you. Each episode, we're going to dive deep into the stories and experiences of individuals who have walked the road of recovery, alongside expert insights from mental health professionals and addiction specialists. Our mission is simple: to provide you with valuable tools, resources, and a supportive community to help you navigate the challenges and celebrate the victories of your recovery journey. So grab a seat, open your heart, open your mind, and let's embark on this transformative journey together. This is Still City Recovery. Today's guest is Dr. David Patton, and David is a criminologist and researcher, speaker and writer, life coach, and interpersonal conflict mediator. So the list does go on, and hopefully we'll talk a little bit more in the podcast today about some of the things that you do. And what I do know about David is that he's a very kind and generous person. He's flying the flag for lived experience recovery organisations here and also the Inclusive Recovery Cities Initiative. My experience is that you are very committed to supporting the recovery community here in Sheffield too, which is awesome. A quote from your website, if I may. In the words of Nelson Mandela, education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. And I'm hoping that we can do a little bit of that today on this podcast. So welcome, David, to Still City.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
It's an honour to have you with us today. So thank you very much indeed for joining us. So first and foremost, would you tell us a little bit about how you came to have such an interest in addiction and recovery?
Yeah, sure. I guess for me, the story kind of goes back to when I was probably around 18 myself, and that I was kind of in the 1990s up in the northeast of England. And at that time, kind of the rave scene kind of hit. So if you were kind of going through that life transition stage of kind of going clubbing for the first time and experimenting in that nighttime economy, that was the kind of scene that you were going to. And it was like this fascinating kind of thing that we'd not had before in the UK. So for those who are younger who'll be listening who don't even know what that is, it was people who went off to Ibiza, and there was this new sound, this kind of like dance kind of sound, and very much house music was connected to it at the time. So that kind of spiritual, positive love vibe that was very central to it, but also kind of dressing up and kind of that contrast for a lot of people of escaping from the mundanity of life, where they were in these kind of 9-to-5 jobs that they didn't necessarily have a purpose in those jobs, and so they wanted to escape that at the weekend, or where life was stressful.
Yes.
So you came together with this wonderful, beautiful bunch of people. And I'm somebody who's never actually used drugs. I drank alcohol at the time, but I've never used drugs. And so it was very much a cosmopolitan kind of culture.
Yes.
And I was fascinated watching kind of friends and family members who went on to use drugs during that scene, and how this culture, as I just described, plus drug use, plus music, changed or impacted identity positively and negatively. And that fascinated me. So the very first piece of research I did when I was doing my criminology degree was around exploring popular culture, music, and drug use, and what is the connection between those three. And the other reason it really is around kind of having family members who unfortunately kind of were addicted to substances.
Okay.
And so this is not just an academic foray as a professor, it's kind of also has a personal kind of bent to it as well.
Totally. And I feel that.
Mm-hmm.
I hear that, but I feel that.
Yeah.
And just touching on what you were talking about there, I was also, heavily entrenched in the house music movement, and it felt very spiritual.
Yes.
People gather in churches, people gathered in clubs, and they were like-minded individuals who were all there to enjoy themselves, but come together in union. And saying that, it almost sounds a bit strange, but I mean, that's what happened.
It did, yeah.
And there was a huge movement and culture around it, really. And I feel very privileged to have been a part of that. The bits I remember. So So how would you describe the current alcohol and drug addiction situation, both locally in Sheffield and also across the UK?
Yeah. And, we know that kind of the number of drug deaths are kind of rising kind of nationally. And I think the figure's around just over 10,000 drug deaths, which is just abhorrent. That here we are and we're kind of espousing that we're one of the most advanced kind of drug treatment and, systems in the world, and the scientific knowledge that we have. We were kind of like this beacon of kind of infrastructure. And actually 10,000 people a year are dying. And that's unacceptable as far as I'm concerned. So for me, I think that it's evident that the system is failing and the system is ill-fitting to meet the needs of this diverse country and the different pathways that exist for somebody who enters that substance use pathway. And I think the reasons for that typically are the dominance of the medical approach that views a person to be a success if their body is simply detoxed from the substance. And the short-term funding of support to keep somebody in that kind of therapeutic environment or care is then cut too far too soon. And so then they're placed back into the same circumstances, relationships and structural factors as they were that led to their addiction. And we need to make significant changes to that system as far as I'm concerned.
Absolutely. I would agree with you. I think that the medical approach obviously is required in early intervention with, like you've just said there, about detoxification, stabilization. But then what comes next is that body and spirit element that actually there's a great deal of work that needs to be done. The detox that happens at the beginning, in my experience, is just the scratch on the surface. There is a lifetime of work that then needs to be done, and our role really, I think, is to ensure people are aware of what those recovery pathways look like. But there's still a lot of stigma associated with addiction, isn't there?
Huge. Stigma is a huge problem because it's that stereotype that it's kind of the dirty junkie. And what I think one of the key issues in the addiction field is that it's individualized the problem. So it's said people like Johnny or Sally who lived in certain postcodes, certain residential neighborhoods. Typically, the poor people is seen as a poor people's kind of disease, although you and I know that it's not.
Quite.
And it's people from dysfunctional families who are unemployed, sort of an underclass kind of level, or it's the person on the street who's homeless and, mental health issues. So that's the stereotype. But we know that addiction does not discriminate. It impacts all strata within society, sexes, social class, financial, whatever your circumstances are. It can impact you.
Totally.
And what we need to come to is the medical model is individualized unintentionally. I'm being generous there. Almost those risk factors, those kind of characteristics that if you possess one of those characteristics, you're more likely to become an addict. And that's, for me, is erroneous, because what I've found in my own work, and hopefully we'll talk about a bit more later, is that you've got to acknowledge the structural factors that lead to addiction. So for me, we've got to talk about, and I am a social scientist, so you have to forgive me, but, patriarchy, capitalism, consumer culture, all of those things that impact the way in which we live our life and construct our relationships and the things that we pursue, the pathways to happiness, pathways to success. They're all actually quite dysfunctional.
That's really interesting. Say a bit more on that, because I'm keen, and hopefully the listeners will be able to pick up on some of this, because it's so interesting, the research that you do, that I hope will help people to understand that it's not a moral deficiency, for example, and it's not just something that poor street homeless people experience.
Or if you've got a certain gene or a high level of impulsivity, or all of those factors. Now, that's not to discount, that those variables do exist, but they're over proportionate in the discourse. And actually, if you think about, let's just take one at a time. Let's take capitalism, and it's kind of this invisible structure. But actually, what that's done is, as I've kind of researched and been around recovery, whenever you come into the community of recovery, people who, are really kind of 5 years plus in recovery, what you're slapped in the face with is this culture. There's some values, there's norms, there's practices. In the same way as you and I spoke about the rave culture, there's a recovery culture. And as I analysed that, I found a whole heap of different values and beliefs and practices. And that got me thinking. And there was a chap once in one of the projects I was involved with, and he said that society has really damaged us, and we've had to operate in these spaces within society. And so that took me on to this idea to kind of analyse culture. So I started looking at the recovery culture, and I started looking at kind of mainstream culture in society. Now, when I looked at capitalism, so this idea that the material objects, consumable goods, the size of my bank account, the postcode that I live in, all kind of gives me a sense of esteem or a sense of success, that I'm better or worse than, depending upon those factors. So I will kind of move away from family, I'll move away from community in order to pursue a job that pays me more money, gives me more kind of status in society, but actually over time, typically will isolate me, make me feel more lonely. Why? Because I've moved away from all my loved ones and support networks. And in the workplace, actually, I'm there as a widget. I'm there to perform and produce. And if I'm not performing or producing, I know I'm vulnerable to losing my position, because I know that the guy to the left of me or the lady to the right of me is pursuing the next promotion along with myself. So I'm in this cutthroat environment, which provides a lot of stress and strain on my mental health, on my body over time. And so operating in this culture where it's not supportive, it's not creative or collaborative, has an impact on myself. And where do I turn to with those deficits over time for comfort, for pleasure? And this is not everybody's story by any means, but actually, I think that a large contribution to the onset of addiction is things like capitalism, but we don't even see it, Jonathan. We don't even think about it, because it's just how we live today. Of course, you pursue the material, but it's isolating us. And, I always laugh on a sunny day like it is today in Sheffield. All of the lawnmowers comes out, in suburbia, and there's about 20 kind of houses or so on my street. And we'll all be there with our lawnmowers on the same day. We'll say hi to Billy next door and to Ben, and, we're laughing as well. But why have we all got 20 lawnmowers? Why are we not sharing these resources? Or as I'm kind of dashing out to my car and I'll see my neighbor over the road, I've lived there for 15 years and still the level of depth and interaction with some of those neighbors, hi, how are you? Yeah, I'm good, thanks. How are you? As we're both busily getting back into our cars. So that lack of community and kind of shared why can't I say, can I borrow your lawnmower? What's wrong with that? Why do we have to have our own lawnmower? And I'm using this as a silly example, but it highlights, I think, a good point.
Makes sense.
Around the fragmentation of community, and also a lack of, I think, within our culture, a capacity to say, help.
Yes. No, I
don't have. Can I use yours?
But if you take recovery as a commodity then.
Yes.
Okay. You take recovery as a commodity and you look at recovery networks, recovery groups, and those people that are in recovery. My experience as somebody in recovery, I see equality.
Yeah.
I see equality. I mix with people who have been street homeless, but I also mix with psychiatrists, barristers, and people that I might not normally have associated with, because again, we're all there for the same reason.
Yes.
And of course, I am sure that there is some social levels and standing within the recovery communities. I do see that at times, but on the whole, it's about equality. It's about sharing. It's about connection. It's about asking to borrow somebody's lawnmower. And this is the difficulty I've found, particularly because recovery, we are sort of ego deflated, and we look at replacing that with humility and
Yes,
love
yes.
and kindness and compassion to self and to others. Now, you talking about capitalism there, and how that recovery, being in recovery, sort of transitions into a capitalist commercial world where there are ideals on what somebody should be doing, where they should be living, what they should be making, being married, children, cars, holidays, all of those things that people now so readily produce and show us on Facebook
Yes.
and social media.
Instagram, yeah.
Now, my experience is actually trying to practice humility in day to day in the work environment doesn't actually necessarily put you in a position where you're in a pole position for that promotion.
Yeah.
So there's a real piece, I think, missing that marries the two worlds up.
Right.
In America, right, people will put on their CV that they're in recovery.
Yeah.
I wrote a piece about being in recovery and working 10 years ago, and I sent it to a couple of people, and they said, well, but if I'm employing somebody in recovery, does that mean they're going to steal from me?
Yes.
So there's this, there's a stigma where we got started on this piece here, and I've probably gone off on a little bit of a tangent there, but I think there's such a big piece missing, and this, going back to the Nelson Mandela quote, it's the education.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Would you agree?
And I think the other side to the coin of the project that I was talking about, which will connect to what you were just saying. So I analysed the culture of society. And then as I was analysing the culture of recovery, so doing interviews with people in recovery, and also we created a multimedia digital whiteboard of people in recovery, different stages of recovery, first year, years 1 to 4 and 5+, and kind of personal capital, social and community. And for anyone who's not familiar with recovery capital, it's just very simple. It's just what assets, what things, what resources have you got, what capacities, skills can you use to make that decision to enter recovery and also to sustain it. And that looks like different things. So personal capital would be kind of like your mental health, physical health, communication, sense of hope, sense of efficacy, agency, so on. Your social capital is about your relationships and the quality of those relationships, either positive, negative, somewhere a mix of the two. And then community capital, to what extent do you feel accepted and that you belong in your local community and that you can access the local resources without the stigma and so on that you spoke about. So when I analysed this culture from the artifacts that they kind of donated, people in recovery donated kind of 17 different forms of media. So we had, drawings, poems, spoken word, paintings, graffiti art, sculptures, you name it. It was a whole smorgasbord of stuff. And I analysed it thematically. And what I found was that at the heart of this culture was one of connection, as we've spoken about. And it's not this kind of fake kind of relationship. Actually, they bring their whole self into the situation. Yeah. So when you say to them, how are you doing? It's not just automatically, yes, I'm fine, thanks, how are you? If they're having a bad day, that comes out in the conversation, as well as the positive things. So it's that solidarity between each other, and actually they're not scared to ask for help. So there's that vulnerability and authenticity that's part of the connection and part of the community. And this desire to give back and support others. So it's not just all about me, myself, and I, and how am I going to gain from this situation or this scenario, but how can I help other people who are on their journey as well to move forwards. It's also about creativity, and a lot of what goes on I think in the daily life, in general society, it squashes creativity. But I think there's a part of us all that needs to express that in all of its diverse forms. That could be in the construction of the outfits that we wear, the type of interior design that we do for our homes. It doesn't have to be necessarily doing a drawing or a painting, although for many in recovery, those traditional creative outlets of drawing and painting are central. But it's creativity in its whole sense. So I think this egalitarianism that you're talking about, this kind of almost non-hierarchical approach, is there in the culture of recovery. People in recovery don't care whether you're a doctor, a top CEO of $1 million company, or formerly street homeless. It's like we're all equal, we're all of equal value, and we're all accepted. And so it's a complete opposite. And what I found is that the culture and the practices in recovery are antidotes to the dysfunction and the harm that the mainstream society culture is creating. And what we're finding, fascinatingly, is that people in recovery have now demonstrating high levels of well-being and quality of life as compared to the average Joe public in the general community. So as far as I'm concerned, people in recovery are the leaders of our society and our culture because they're showing us these are the pathways to well-being. These are the pathways to quality of life. And all of these BS models that we've been given, that we've inherited from our culture, that this is the means to happiness and success. It's giving us mental health, it's giving us addiction, it's giving us isolation, disconnection, competition, all of that negative stuff that isn't working.
Well, I hope there is going to be an uprising, and I love the passion that you speak with, because it helps enormously, because we need people like you supporting the recovery movement, and the supporting the generation of the recovery cities, and for people to actually understand the importance of it and how it can actually support the local, national, global economy.
Yes.
In having very good, honest, passionate people involved in business.
Yes.
And I think that there is a bridge that needs to be built there. So on that, I'm really interested to learn more about recovery cities, and we're going to talk a little bit more about some of your research a bit later on and some of the things that you've achieved. But I'm fascinated by how we can put sort of Sheffield on the map and be, part of that inclusive recovery cities in the UK.
Yeah. So inclusive recovery cities is kind of Professor David Best, Leeds Trinity University, and Charlotte Coleman. They came together and kind of coined this kind of notion of having a recovery city. And I think it challenges, as I was talking about earlier, this focus and this gaze constantly on the individual. What's in your personal history? What's gone wrong in your life course? And it opens it up to structural factors at the city and national level, along the lines that I've just been speaking about. So what it's seeking to do is to get a group of people together in that city, kind of to create a recovery council who then work collaboratively and positively with others across a whole range of sectors, employment, education, people, local businesses, so on and so forth, the recovery and drug treatment industries as well.
Yeah.
Unfortunately,
yes,
a lot of education is needed there, more so. To how can we be more inclusive to people who are on this journey, who, have been in addiction, now in recovery? How can we be more inclusive? And also, how can we celebrate the strengths, the power, and the capacities of these beautiful people who've gone through that transformation? Is something that should be celebrated. So, we're working together. We kind of started. So there's myself, Tracy Ford, Kevin, Ash, who are the two drug commissioners. There's Mania from Project 6 and Rifat from Humankind, who are part of the council in Sheffield, trying to work strategically with partners as to how can we get this message out there. So if anyone who's listening would be interested in partnering with us and kind of raising awareness around what recovery is and how we can support and celebrate recovery, then it'd be great to hear from them.
Thank you. Well, I hope so, because we're going to post this out on LinkedIn and across some business networks for people to hear and hopefully get involved in and feel compelled to support the movement, really.
Yeah. Just one quick story on that around businesses. So I'm a trustee for Recovery Connections in the Northeast, and they've got a partnership with a big local business there, PD Ports, and their policy used to be that anybody found, using substances was automatically dismissed. And there was, very good reasons for that. They're operating cranes and there's health and safety kind of, life risks, really.
Yes.
Yeah. But there was this one chap at that time who was found kind of using drugs and was instantly dismissed, lost his job, and that the chap, didn't feel that he could go home and tell his wife, so unfortunately he killed himself.
Oh, dear.
And so that was a wake-up call for that, the CEO at that time, who's now working kind of collaboratively with a recovery organization. Recovery Connections has a presence in that organization. They're doing that education awareness raising that you've spoken about. That's so key. And they now have a very different policy and approach. So they're supporting people in employment. And I think that's what's needed as well. So thanks for that plug.
No, absolutely. And I agree with you. And it's something that we are working as well independently
Yes.
with some companies in the construction industry.
Fabulous.
As well, to be able to try and change that culture of, that sort of hire and fire.
Yes.
Based on whether somebody is positive or negative in a drug test. So that's great. So you recently published a paper with David Best and Lorna Brown describing how the pains of recovery can impact the recovery process.
Yeah.
Can you briefly describe how people in recovery experience these pains and the impact that they have on their recovery process?
Yeah. So basically in the research, we use a life course approach, because what often you will find with drugs research, Jonathan, for people who quote studies, you've always got to look back to the methods that we used. And typically you'll get kind of like a snapshot survey, which is all about what's occurring at that particular time point in the person's life. But you and I know that there's a whole complex web of reasons that precede that journey into addiction and post the addiction as well. So as far as I'm concerned, and with my work, I use a life course approach to look at different seasons and stages of a person's life, asking them questions at different ages, what things were occurring, positive and negative, and you look for changes and patterns. And what I've found is a dynamic interaction, a nuanced interaction between different variables. And I've called these kind of push and pull factors.
Okay.
Because what you often hear is a common misunderstanding is that you have got to wait for like some dire life circumstances so that somebody hits a rock bottom after many, many years, sometimes decades, before they'll make that shift of, I'm going to enter recovery. I've had enough now. Well, you don't have to wait for that. And you hear professionals espousing this as well.
Yes.
You know as well as I do that you make the change from where you are today. You don't wait to go further and further down a black hole before you have this epiphany of, I need to make a change. You start climbing from where you are. And actually, what you find is that when someone's down that hole, you need someone with a hand to pull you up.
Yeah.
So I've identified these whole range of pull factors, which stand in opposition to the pains of recovery. So the pains of recovery, just to kind of paint the picture, would be things like childhood trauma, would be living with a sense of hopelessness or purposelessness, having such dire life circumstances that you're unemployed or you're engaged in either menial jobs, or the job that you're engaged in is so disconnected from your own inner sense of purpose and fulfillment that it's almost like you're dying inside as you're going to this well-paid, achieving job. It's things like the quality of your housing, the stability of it. But what I've just found in an article I published a couple of weeks ago, for women in recovery and housing transitions, actually, is not necessarily about the quality of the housing, although that's obviously important, but it's about the relationships in that household, in that accommodation, and in the surrounding environment. That's what has the most impact. So you had some people who were in, as they described, excuse me for a moment, but they described as shitty bedsits, but because they had a positive community around them, they were able to grow and flourish. So you've got all of these pains, these negatives, if you like, that as a person enters recovery, that first year of recovery, where we know that relapse rates or return to use rates are very high, 50 to 75%. It varies from person to person. Yeah. And the reason for that is because you've got all of those kind of negative pains present in your life course at that point. Whereas when you get to year 5 in stable recovery, the number of pains have reduced massively, and the forms of recovery capital, those positive factors, those pull factors, are dominating. So really it's that years 1 to 4, it's the messy middle, if you like, where you're kind of swapping and working through the stuff. Because all of those factors that I just mentioned can't be ignored. There's no magic wand that's going to make them go away. No. You've got to work it through every relationship,
We talk about leaving no stone unturned.
Yes.
And, there are different recovery modalities and pathways that people people take. But, we alluded to it earlier, that initial medical detoxification bit.
Yeah.
Actually, what that does is removes the only thing that soothes us from the pain and discomfort from adverse childhood experiences, trauma, complex family dynamics, housing, friendships, and all the other things that can negatively impact one's life. So, the importance there after to transition, during this, I suppose, 1 to 3, 1 to 5 year period, there has to be a lot of work done in order for someone to get to a place where they can build some recovery capital.
Yes.
And work through those, in some ways, generational burdens and traumas, which some don't even belong to them.
Yes.
But they carry them around like a heavy weight. So like unloading the rucksack.
Yeah.
And that pull factor of somebody saying, look, I've done it.
Yeah.
I've been here before. I've experienced some of the things that you've experienced.
Yeah.
And I can help you move from this pain into peace.
Absolutely.
Okay. Because we talk about hope, don't we? We hold on, pain ends, as we like to describe it. And I think that's a beautiful analogy. But again, people only know what they know, don't they? And if they're living in that life and we take away the only thing that gives them any kind of peace, we have to replace it with something.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's not like people haven't tried before, the whole thing of willpower. It's pull yourself together, just stop using the thing. And again, that individualizes the problem, doesn't it? And what they don't see is that whole backlog of pains and the interconnections between those pains as well.
I was on the phone with somebody yesterday, and they were wanting to get into a detox and into a rehab, and I said, so why now? And they said, well, the last thing I tried was I was asked to reduce my drinking and to keep a drinking diary, and that failed. And I said to the person who suggested that if I could do that, I wouldn't be ringing and asking for help in the first place. I'm desperate. So it's really interesting how people are given possible pathways and solutions from different people in the profession who may not, again, fully understand addiction.
Yeah. And it's really important. Research is very clear that, so for me, an alarm bell is whenever you hear somebody saying, this is the way you recover, that's an alarm bell. Because actually they've got no idea what your pathway will look like. And neither do you at that point.
No.
Okay. So what we can see, as David Best and colleagues across Europe did kind of European pathways. They found that people try most mechanisms at some stage during their recovery journey. And it's only through this kind of process of trial and error that as they kind of meet opportunities, resources, people, communities, so on and so forth, that connect with those preceding kind of variables, the pains of recovery, that provide the antidote to them, does that begin to the healing and transformative process. But oftentimes, if the person knew at the outset, well, I need these 6 things as the antidotes to these 6 pains, that just doesn't happen in the real world, does it? So that's why it's kind of this trial and error process. And that's why if someone's advocating this is the way to recover, it's dangerous. That was their way. That's what's worked for them. And yes, they may well have seen it work for lots of other people. It doesn't mean to say it's going to work for the person in front of you.
No.
So you've just got to provide an opportunity for someone to explore.
Absolutely. It's about giving people options.
Yes, choice.
Where they can make an informed choice and decision about what feels right for them. Because let's have it right, we are dictated to about how things should be, how things should look, and how recovery should be. And it's not a one-size-fits-all experience, this.
Yes.
And, my own experience, what I knew at 1 week, 1 year versus what I now know a few years down the line are very different. And my concepts and understanding have changed. And it's that empowerment, people talk about empowerment. I like to call it empowerment. I like that. Because that's the education and the knowledge that I've picked up from people over the years, from what I've read, what I've heard, what I've felt, what I've seen, and say, actually, these are the bits that are really going to work for me.
Yeah.
Core fundamentals is, yes, I've got a recovery program, but then what's attached to that as individual components are what really make my life the way that it is today, which in the main is pretty good.
Yes.
As I sit here sober, not had a drink today, and I have no intention of having one either.
Yes.
So that's what this is all about.
And Jonathan, just on that though, just for people who might be listening who are still in the midst of addiction, that recovery is not just about substance cessation, is it? So as you're saying about your life here right now, we're celebrating that fact, but we're also celebrating the levels of fulfillment, your levels of well-being, your levels of kind of mental health, positive relationships, sense of fulfillment. It's actually this more holistic recovery is a holistic kind of process and outcome, in my view, not just the cessation or increased control over substance. I think it's much bigger than that.
I totally agree. I mean, the drink and the drugs were the symptom.
Yes, great.
And that's how we see it, because people go, oh, if I stop drinking or I stop taking drugs, life's going to be awesome. And you go, yeah, maybe, but there's a hell of a lot of work you've also got to do alongside that, because you take them away, we're still left with me. And I'm still left with all the stuff that I carry that actually exacerbated the reason and purpose why I drank in the first place. You know, so it's so important. I remember going into treatment, and I know I'm interviewing you, but I thought I'd just share this. Is I remember going into rehab, and the counsellor said to me, he said, "You're a lucky lad." I said, "Why is that?" He said, "Because you've only got to change one thing." I said, "Great, what's that?" He said, "Everything." And my world fell apart for a little moment there. But he said, "We do it one day at a time."
Right, yes.
Oh, and I was so relieved. And he said, "I've been doing it one day at a time for 33 years now, and I'm all right." Life still comes, things still happen, we still get knocks. But ultimately, I've not had a drink today. And that's because I'm not in as much pain as I was. And I said, we can celebrate that.
Absolutely.
And that's the bit of hope, isn't it?
Absolutely.
That's the bit of hope.
Yeah. It is possible.
So I wanted to also ask you, because you recently attended the 67th session of the UN's Commission on Narcotic Drugs, and I'm really interested to hear about your experience there, because I know one or two people who came along with you as well, and it was their first time experience there. But I just think that is such a powerful opportunity to go and centre stage what you're doing and the research that you conduct.
It was a fabulous opportunity, for somebody coming from the Northeast and the background that I have, kind of to be given that opportunity to sit at that table. It was really impressive. But what was also kind of to encourage people, really, I was privileged to kind of be invited to this resolution that the UN were bringing in around recovery, which was fantastic. This acknowledgement, or this extension of the understanding of recovery as a resolution for all of the countries that have signed up to the UN to then follow. And I was sat in the meeting, and I was sat with the UK kind of government, and there was this resolution that was being discussed and debated, and the UK government had asked for the insertion of a particular phrase, nothing controversial, just, support services, recovery support services, 3 words. Well, a 2-hour debate then ensued between all of the different countries. So it was like the Eurovision for drug policy. It was really funny. But after 2 hours of debate, the room finally agreed that, yes, we can insert the phrase that the UK government had suggested. So it was like big victory, we're all kind of internally celebrating. But at this point, Russia comes in to the room and apologizes for being 2 hours late. And she then says, "Chair, please update me on what have I missed?" So the chair does a brief kind of synopsis that we're just agreed that this phrase, I'm really sorry, no, I must veto this phrase.
Really?
Russia could not accept that. So I was told I had to leave at that point. Another 4-hour discussion then ensued. And so a lot of the gaze is, wow, the United Nations, this kind of epicenter for power and
Yes.
change. But while people are there discussing a 3-word phrase for days on end, people in the communities are overcoming and transforming from addiction to recovery.
Yes.
That while people are talking and creating these documents that a lot of people, I would imagine, will never read in recovery. So you've got to look at where is the real power and change occurring. Yes, everyone's trying to get into those arenas, but for me, I want to be over here in the communities, because I think that's where the true power and the true change is really occurring.
I totally agree with you, and thank you for sharing your experience. It'll hopefully give the listeners some insight into what happens around those tables and in those discussions. But I totally agree with you. I mean, I've never read a policy that's come out of one of those committee meetings, and I imagine probably a lot of people would never see them or even know that they exist.
Yes,
because it's like, well, how does that filter down? How does that filter down, and how does that actually work on the ground? Because it's about action on the ground.
Sure.
And that's where the power is, I think, and that's where the change is. And when people are, affecting change up here at a government level, my question is, how well placed are they to do that?
Yes.
And then how does that information actually filter down to a street level?
Yes.
And be implemented?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are lots of really great people operating at the policy level, as well as a lot of well-intentioned people who actually, because they're not coming from that research background, they're actually not very well informed as to the issues, or they have a lack of connection to the community. And again, for me, I think that's where some change needs to occur in the structuring of those policy-making kind of positions, that if you don't have connections with the communities and the people that you're writing the policies about, and they're not sat at the table creating the policies with you,
yes,
and I think practice is improving around co-production, which is really great to see. And the idea is that the policies are written, and that then filters down through civil society organizations, third sector organizations, and that best practice that is espoused is then supposed to come through to practice. But, as we know, people on the ground are so busy dealing at the coalface that they never have the time to read nor necessarily understand the complexity of what's been written in these convoluted reports, oftentimes from the staff's perception.
Totally.
Yeah.
I mean, we have a lot of passionate people. We have a great movement and recovery movement in Sheffield and I know in other cities as well. But I mean, ultimately, it's about how do we fund that change.
Yes.
And one of the questions that we spoke a little bit about earlier, but I want to ask you in more detail now, is like, how do we go about removing some of the stigma around addiction, but also around recovery and what that actually is? We've talked about education, but there must be some other areas that we can sort of focus in on to change the hearts and minds of people.
Yeah. Well, I think it's about changing the narrative and changing the lens, isn't it, from the individual stuff that we spoke about earlier. And so really, I think that the movement is changing because people in the communities are standing up going, I'm in recovery. And that is the most powerful witness, because people in your neighborhood, on your street, or in your workplace who've known you, who know that you're a good person, have seen the change that you've gone through, go, wow, change is possible. He has been able to change. Yeah, he did go through that, or she did go through that rough patch. But now look at what they're doing. Look at how they're giving back to the community. Look at what a positive example they are, how happy they are, how their sense of well-being is kind of fully on display.
Yes.
That is a large part of the visibility and public celebration of recovery is essential. And that's one of the ways in which we challenge stigma. Education is another big one. And I think we've got to start early on with this.
Yes.
So a lot of the work I used to do kind of back in the youth offending service was around kind of using cultural artifacts and music for people to reflect on their own kind of attitudes and values around a whole range of issues. Because so I run a third year undergraduate module at the moment around substance misuse, and we go into the local kind of shopping centre and I get them to take photographs of every birthday card, magazine, t-shirt, pair of socks, health product that is is really promoting a hedonistic lifestyle, or let's get hammered,
Yeah.
or let's get off your face on drugs. And they come back literally with between 50 to 100 photographs
Really?
under an hour of a visit to your local shopping centre. You can't buy, very rarely can you buy a birthday card that is not encouraging someone to get absolutely hammered.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, every christening card, birthday card, wedding, it's all about that level of intoxication. And so celebration has become synonymous with alcohol and drug use. Similar with movies that we're watching, soap operas, magazines that we're buying. You know, Mix Mag was a classic example back in the day.
Yeah.
That you've got these whole magazines devoted to, and listen, I'm not saying this in a judgmental way, but how the culture has shifted. So there's a whole theory in academia around normalization of drug use. And it's not about, the majority of young people taking drugs, but actually it's this barometer change, this cultural change to the place of drugs and drug signs and symbols in media and in consumables, and what role are they occupying. And I think for a large part of the society and the community, we're switched off to the prevalence of that. And it's like, well, it's okay. Certain forms of drug use are okay. So if it's middle class people using drugs or having consumption of drugs in leisure time, that's fine. But if it's the poor people or the dropouts who are addicted, and so we've got to make people aware of these judgments that have been created and making them aware of the power imbalance and the inequality and the problems that that's creating in our society that we're paying for through tax, money, through kind of living in fear in certain neighborhoods of, will I be burgled? Will I be, all of that stuff is, we're creating the problem, but then we're trying to demonize and other people at the same time. So there's a huge educational campaign. There's lots of work with employers that can be done around creating more equitable approaches to understanding that people will have struggles during their employment with you. And how are you going to get the best from that individual and also from your workforce? What message and what culture do you want to create in your workforce? Because we know that this kind of ironclad, kind of, again, stigmatizing, punitive approach doesn't work.
No.
It's the same as a parenting style. If you adopt that style with your child, the child typically rebels.
Correct.
And levels of dysfunction start to manifest at some point during that child's life course that was created as a result of that culture.
Yes.
So for me, a lot of the stigma stuff comes back to actually cultural issues. How can we change the culture? And I think that having this expectation that we're all kind of like this perfect, it comes back to capitalism for me, that we've all got to be these widgets who are performing and productive at the highest levels all time. And we can't be.
No.
We just can't. And so how can we create pathways within any culture that are restorative, that acknowledge that people are going to mess up, but that we're going to be inclusive. Yes, we're going to hold people to account. So, I don't want to be some sort of hippie liberal where we pretend that, if someone's burgled somebody or assaulted somebody, there's got to be accountability for those actions, for those harms. We can't pretend that they've not occurred, or the reason for this is because when they were X age or Y age, so therefore we can excuse it. I'm not saying that, but we have to have pathways for people to go to make amends and to restore after a time of difficulty. And we don't have those in a capitalist mode of culture. No. It's all about perfection.
Well, it is. And, it's about actually giving people a chance.
Yes.
Giving somebody a chance, because as we talked about earlier, addiction is not a moral deficiency, and it's not a choice. I didn't wake up one morning and say, I fancy becoming an alcoholic.
Yes.
Because that looks and sounds like a right laugh.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's more than one chance as well. Some people go, okay, well, we've given you a chance and you've ruined it. Well, of course, we know that it's a chronic, recurring, ongoing process.
Yes.
And so if you're just going to give somebody one chance, then, they probably are going to let you down. They are going to fail. But that's not what we're talking about here. And I always say, let's think about if you were to ask somebody, what's the worst, and I'm asking you to answer this, by the way, but what's the worst thing you've ever done? Now publicly disclose that and let me give you a punishment for that, and let me require you never to be imperfect in that area again. And you tell me, have you ever managed to never be imperfect in that area? So we've got to have this kind of equilibrium. Okay, if we're going to apply this judgmental frame to other people, let's also apply it to ourselves. And what we realize is we need to have that humility and go, we're all human. We all make mistakes.
True.
And we all need kind of,
And we all need a chance.
Yes.
Because whether you are suffering with substance use disorder, alcohol use disorder, or not, everybody makes mistakes on some level.
Yeah.
However, if you are prone to alcohol dependency, it seems that society will come down on you like a ton of bricks. And that's the inequality currently that we are seeing. I think we're just coming towards the end of our interview, and it's been brilliant. I've really, really enjoyed listening to you, and I've learned a great deal, and I hope so have our listeners. But I just wanted to ask you if you think there is anything else that I've not asked you, or anything you want to share about you to our listeners that, you know, you'd like to do.
Yeah, thank you. It's been great, and I've kind of learned so much as well. So thank you for this time and this space to have these conversations. I think just my last thing would be kind of for anyone who is kind of struggling in whatever area, understand that there are opportunities for you to heal and change and to grow. And yes, it requires effort on your part to reach out and ask for help. So I just encourage people to ask for that help that they may need at this time. And even if that doesn't work out, that particular thing that you've asked for help for, it will lead you closer to the thing that is going to help you and address some of those pains of recovery that we spoke about. It is that ongoing iterative journey, you know. So I think, go easy on yourself.
I love that.
And ask for your help.
I love that. And what I would do, just to add to that as well, is maybe seek out people who are or have also struggled with addiction.
Yes.
Because you will certainly receive open arms from that person, rather than going and speaking to somebody who might not necessarily understand it.
Yes.
So thank you very much indeed, David, for those words and pearls of wisdom. But there is a solution. Recovery is possible, and there are lots of people out here in Sheffield that are willing to lend a listening ear and a little bit of their confidence and compassion too. Yeah. David, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Jonathan.
It's been wonderful.
Great.
Thank you.